Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. Irwin Redlener has devoted his adult life to meeting the health and other critical needs of disadvantaged children. He's a physician and the founder, with the singer Paul Simon, of the Children's Health Fund, which has a fleet of fully equipped mobile medical vans which bring health services to children who in many cases would otherwise have to do without. Dr. Redlener has now written a compelling memoir called The Future of Us: What the Dreams of Children Mean for 21st Century America. Dr. Redlener, Irwin, how are you?
Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
You too. So your book talks about the dreams and the aspirations of children, not just the need for food or shelter or health care. Why the focus on dreams and aspirations?
Well, one of the things that's occurred to me over the years, Bob, is this notion that if you ask a group of children who are very disadvantaged what they want to be when they grow up, which I always asked as a pediatrician, the answers are indistinguishable from what you would get if you were speaking to a group of much more affluent children. So children start off very smart. They start off with serious aspirations, and depending on their age, they want to be, firefighters or police officers, and then they want to be doctors and scientists and teachers.
Right.
And you cannot tell what a group of answers, whether it represents the answers of poor children or more affluent children. So the point is that the barriers, though, that face poor and disadvantaged children are so much more severe and sometimes impenetrable than is the case for more affluent kids. And this opportunity gap between the better off and the not so well off is something that strikes me as an important reality as we look at the future of the country, because in fact we do need every child from every socioeconomic group, from every racial group, to have the same opportunity to fulfill their dreams and aspirations as any other child.
Now, you co-founded the Children's Health Fund, I believe it was 1986, with Paul Simon.
Right.
Tell us what the Children's Health Fund is and how you got hooked up with Paul Simon.
Well, yeah, so the Children's Health Fund has become what it was designed to be way back when we started talking about it in 1986, which is a healthcare system that would understand the barriers that caused poor children to have difficulty getting health care. And we were going to figure out a way to make sure that equitable access to good quality health care was available, starting with the homeless children here in New York City, and then spreading, of course, to a national network. We now have 53 of those mobile children's clinics around the country in urban and rural areas. But the point is,
I remember when you had one. Now you have 53.
My memory's stretched, but I'm remembering that also. Thank you for thinking about that. Yeah, it was like, it was one to begin with, obviously, but we really had in mind to create a model that would be applicable really anywhere in the country.
Right.
And the whole idea was, as opposed to having children have to show up in our crowded clinics and our teaching hospitals and our public clinics and so on, that we would create a system where we would literally bring the health care, including the doctors, the nurses, the whole medical team, to where those children and families were, which included that in those early years, many, many homeless shelters here in the city. The model worked very well, but the other thing about it is that we built into this a commitment to providing very high quality health care. This is not just random visits by a group of concerned doctors, but it's actually a system that does quality health care for the children we're serving.
You became a doctor in 1969, which was a turbulent period in our history, to say the least. There were many things you could have been. Why medicine?
Well, I'd always been interested in helping people. These are some very early childhood memories of wanting to be there for people especially in need. And then of course I veered into pediatrics, having to do with some experiences I had as a late teenager working on a program that put me in not put me in, but put me for an experience working at a reform school, which is literally prison for young children,
Right.
and seeing a 6-year-old who was incarcerated was a very, very striking experience for me that I never forgot. And I sort of knew at that moment, this was before I even went to medical school, that whatever I did, I wanted to work with children and figure out how to make sure that kids had equal access to justice and humanity and mercy, and not be treated like an adult felon. So this was in my mind when I ended up choosing pediatrics as the specialty I was concerned about and interested in.
Now, even as a pediatrician, you could have taken a different route and ended up, I don't know, with the Park Avenue practice or whatever.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah,
he
I didn't mean to
shudders.
shudder. No,
He
no.
shudders on the set.
I know, I just think, you're not supposed to shudder on
Well,
something.
very early in your
Yeah.
career, you found yourself not on Park Avenue, but in Lee County, I believe it was,
Yeah.
Arkansas.
Right.
Tell us about that. How'd you end up there, and what was Lee County, Arkansas like in the early 1970s?
So I was training in pediatrics at the University of Colorado in Denver, and I was headed towards a career in pediatric cardiology. It was late in the academic year. I was in the doctor's dining room, and I noticed on the bulletin board in the dining room, and actually an advertisement, a poster saying, in essence, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, which was the old Volunteers in Service to America, the old
Right.
VISTA slogan. And it described, first of all, I had a picture, a black and white picture of a doctor walking down an old country road carrying his doctor's black bag, and then some data about Lee County, Arkansas, which was at that point the 6th poorest county in the United States. Very large black majority of the population, but the whites controlled every single political position and all the budgeting for the county.
Right.
And everybody was under the poverty guidelines, basically. So I dropped my pediatric cardiology plans and headed to Arkansas, where I'd come from, born in Brooklyn. I was basically a city kid, found myself in a state I was completely unfamiliar with in this incredibly impoverished rural corner of the planet, and spent 2 years there running a medical program that was enmeshed in the racial and economic and political turmoil of those years. And it was very intense. In some places it was not all that safe. But I was an activist doctor working on a mission that I very much believed in, and met some extraordinary people who became mentors of mine. But that's really how my whole sense of I could do something about these big problems if I plant myself somewhere where I could really make a difference in the way that I thought I should.
You actually had some harrowing personal encounters in Lee County. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. If you're talking about crosses burning on my lawn and being followed by members of the White Citizens Council and KKK and their pickup trucks with guns in the back of the in their back windows, yeah, I was not comfortable. Although I was a little too naive to really, if it was one of my own kids, I'd be terrified and try to do whatever I could to maybe help protect them. But I just stayed there and sort of oblivious. And part of it was, it was the times. We were living in very seriously significant times of change in the country, lots of violence, the civil rights movement, assassinations happening, political turmoil. And one of the things that happened in my internship was, during my internship in May of 1970, there was the Kent State shootings.
Right.
Where National Guardsmen fired on kids at Kent State University, killing 4 young people.
Just
and I thought,
gunned them down.
Gunning them down, it was like a war zone, and I thought this was the end of our democracy. How could we survive this? I was very revved up as a young person, part of the Kennedy Johnson era, and raring to go. So nothing was going to stop me from doing what I needed to do in Arkansas. And plus, I was thinking that we would solve these problems of poverty and access to care challenges for poor children. I was predicting in the early 70s, maybe a decade and a half, and we'd be done with that. But turns out almost a half century later, not quite the case.
Well, poverty was at the core of the problems that you were encountering, that these
And
poor
racism.
families, poverty and racism, that these poor families had to deal with. So it was inextricably woven
Correct.
into their health situation. Now, fast forward to 2017, and it's still poverty and racism to a great degree. Why have we not made more progress over all that time?
Well, it's a mystery, but it's a mystery that we could probably understand if we look at some of the roots of our society. Unfortunately, we have ideologies that are not working together. We have a strong sort of historic responsibility for not only accepting racism, but we kidnapped millions of people from Africa, 400 years ago, enslaved them. Slavery ended, then we had Jim Crow, and now we have institutional racism. So the roots of what we're dealing with are very, very deep, unfortunately. And in fact, this last election exposed some of the depth of those roots and how much work we have to do to get this country right. In those years, it was absolutely a factor in what was going on and what people were experiencing. A very small group in that region controlling the power and the money, and it actually affected my medical practice in very interesting ways. One of the things was, after clinic hours, every single night, I would make house calls. They give me a list of people to visit, and during the rainy season, since the roads leading to clusters of black homes were never paved or graveled, my vehicle would get stuck in the mud. I was impaired in my actually doing my work because political decisions made back in the in the courthouse and the county seat, and I ended up doing a lot of political activism, even as a doctor, telling people, listen, I can't do my work. I can't get to your children if the roads aren't paved, and roads won't be paved or graveled until you change the power structure here. Right. So voting was part of my prescription for what that county needed, and it became, and I write about this in the book, it became a really important part. In addition to being able to practice what I thought was very high quality medicine, I had to be socially, economically, and politically aware in order to be able to get done the things that needed to get done.
And the same goes today. Voting is such an important part of making some progress on some of these issues that people claim to care so much about. But speaking of political activism, you managed to bring Joan Baez, the politically active singer, if there ever was one, to Lee County. How did that happen?
Well, it was pretty random. I was reading the Arkansas Gazette one Sunday, and I see a little piece about Joan Baez, and mentioned her manager's name, and that he was in Boston, Manny Greenhill. So I just randomly, this is, pre-Google days, so I just kind of called information, got this guy's number. I called him. He's quite gruff. What do you want? I said, well, I'm struggling here down in this clinic in East Arkansas. We're struggling financially. We have a critical situation. I was wondering if Joan might like to help us. He said, well, send me some stuff. I'll send it on to her. Click. He hangs up. So I wrote her a letter and sent some photographs of what we were seeing in Lee County to Manny. He sent it to Joan. A couple of weeks later, I get the nurse says to me, I'm in the clinic seeing patients. She says there's some lady named Joan on the phone.
Some lady named Joan.
And I didn't quite remember, but anyway, so I didn't remember that I'd even written to her at that particular second, but I went, and it's Joan Baez. And she says, how can I help you? She said, I read your letter, I saw the pictures, what can I do? I said, well, we're running out of cash. This clinic may have to close. Could you help? She said, sure. Why don't I do a concert for you? So long story short, and she insisted on coming to Arkansas first to meet people there. She stayed for 3 days with a very, very poor black family in the middle of nowhere. And I came and picked her up. She was sitting on the porch playing her guitar and singing with the kids. And then she did the concert. The concert raised only a modest amount of money, but what she did was she wrote a letter, actually a sketch, to the governor of Arkansas at that time, demanding that he release federal funds that he'd been holding up for the clinic. And that leveraged about $1 million for us, and it completely saved the day. And we, Joan and my wife Karen have been friends ever since. But that's what happened. And I was spoiled at times. I thought, oh well, it's pretty easy to get celebrities involved.
Pretty easy.
No, it's not. Yeah.
It's not really all that easy. So in the course of your career, which was as much about political activism as it was about medicine, you found yourself at the scene of a series of pretty catastrophic disasters, some natural, some man-made. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, first of all, in medicine, one of the reasons I was going originally into cardiology, I liked high-level, intensive situations where lives are on the line. So from a medical point of view, I was drawn to, acute care pediatrics, but also to figure out how I could respond to major disasters. And so I took medical teams to earthquakes in Central America and to go to places where there was very severe famine, food shortages, and so on. I worked with USA for Africa in sub-Saharan Africa during the big crisis in the mid-1980s. And then, so always in the back of my mind was this interest and ability to deal with large-scale disasters. What all came together, interestingly, when I was writing the book, and I had to try to, it was a really good exercise for me to make sense of my whole sort of career. But what happens in a big disaster is that those who are at risk get even more vulnerable during and after a major disaster. So children I was concerned about anyway, who were living in poverty and with all the other social and economic adversities that they were facing, that when a disaster hit, lives got infinitely worse. Even now, and I've been down in Puerto Rico and I'm working down there after Hurricane Maria, and I was in Texas and Florida and so on with the recent hurricanes. What we see is exactly what I am really focused on now, which is how much worse does a disaster make the lives and opportunities for children in places where they were in bad shape beforehand, even worse shape after the disaster. So that's one of the drivers for me staying in this dual hat reality of dealing with disasters and dealing with children who are facing adversities.
You're the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness up at Columbia University. If you look at the landscape now, we seem to be pretty vulnerable to a number of different types of potentially very terrible disasters. If you look at the climate, if you look at
Exactly.
Political situations internationally, what concerns you? Are there a couple of things that concern you most?
Well, there's two categories of things. One are the acute things which we don't have much control over. Let's say a hostile nation decides to cyber attack us and knock out the electrical grid in the United States or anywhere else in the world. This is a profoundly destructive thing to consider happening in the future. We have other things that we can't control, super volcanoes, etc. But what I'm really focused on are the things that are preventable, that may be caused by, human inactivity or, like for example, the continuing to allow climate change affect the frequency and the severity of storms that we will be experiencing in the future. These are things that we could potentially put a brake on if we had appropriate climate policies and so on. Other things like the possibility of nuclear war, which is suddenly back on the news after all the saber rattling with North Korea,
right.
And hopefully that'll get under control. But we're facing all kinds of dangers now that we could potentially experience, and things that we really need to be working on right now.
And again, politics is intimately involved. You need office holders, political leaders, and that sort of thing to sort of take the lead in preparing us for these potential disasters.
Yes, but now we have a president in Donald Trump who is basically eradicating all scientific information and scientific information to drive public policy. So
Right.
if you look at his appointments in the Departments of Energy and Department of Commerce, all over the place, he's extricating the scientists and replacing them with ideologues, all to our peril, short and long term. And I don't know what we're going to do about that, but this is a real problem that we're facing, that we're going to have to, get grown up about and deal with this at its core.
Despite all the wonderful work that you and many others have done, we seem to be in a period where we're not making progress and maybe even going backwards when it comes to things like poverty or children's health care or social and economic equity. How would you sort of assess the landscape here in the U.S. when it comes to those issues?
Well, so this is a really interesting question because, you could probably guess what my political leanings are. However, when I first started my career in 1971 in Arkansas, and you looked at this next, 46 years till now, we see all kinds of combinations of Democratic and Republican presidents, control of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And the poverty needle has never gotten below, for children, never gotten below 10% of all kids living in serious poverty. And it's up to, right now, 18%. It's been as high as 21%. So the eradication of these fundamental issues or the complete elimination of racial discrimination and factors in our system has not been materialized. Progress has been made, and you look at the Johnson War on poverty,
Right.
the civil rights movement. We make rhetorical progress, but we don't seem to get to the finish line where we've eradicated some of these factors, which I think we have the wherewithal to do. In the 50s and 60s, when the U.S. was supreme, we influenced everything. We were the strongest military power, economic power, influencer on the planet. Now we're looking at a future where America's dominance in just influence and spreading democracy is threatened. And one of the problems is we're not making the right investments to keep us strong and functional in a much more competitive environment. And this is a problem that hopefully we'll sort of take charge of. But right now we're looking at one of the most divided times that I can remember in my lifetime, and extreme ideological points of view that have been exacerbated by President Trump and by social media. It's like a weird time now because I don't really see how we're going to get out of this mess we're in. I'm hoping that much better minds than mine will take some responsibility for fixing what we've got.
One of the things that you've written about and talked about a lot is the resilience of children. So in many cases, you'll have children who are growing up in poverty or who have been caught up in terrible disasters, other awful situations,
Sure.
sometimes very abusive homes, and yet they flourish. They manage to
Absolutely.
flourish coming out of environments in which the majority of youngsters don't do that well. Talk about what makes some children more resilient than others.
So resilience is a key factor for communities, for societies, countries, and of course individuals. There's a certain amount of genetic resilience that some children have and others don't. But resilience and the ability to self-regulate and respond effectively and not extremely to all kinds of adversities is in fact a inbred characteristic just born with for certain children. It is reinforced or it's undermined by other factors, external factors. For example, parenting. Parents are extremely important factors in raising successful children who are resilient and capable of reaching their full potential. And it's always true that anecdotally we'll see kids coming out of the worst possible situations and just to find themselves thriving and being successful in the future. The problem is the majority don't. They may get by, but we have too many that do not escape that trap. And so people say to me, if you're a Republican, people say, well, this is the parents' responsibility. They need to pull themselves and their children up by their own bootstraps, should they even have boots or straps.
Right.
And I think there's certain truth to that. Parents have a very, very important role here, but so does government. Democrats like government programs, and Republicans seem to like parents and bootstraps.
Right.
In fact, it takes both. And the reality is that governments cannot raise children, but parents also cannot build schools. So if we want kids to be well educated, we need good parenting, and we need parents who know what they're doing and understand how they have to buffer their children from adversities and allow them to thrive, but that we also have to recognize that without the schools and the programs and the opportunities to succeed, even the best of parents is not going to get anywhere. So I think what we're looking at going forward is a much more enriched understanding of how the right-wing and the left-wing ideologies need to mesh for the benefit of our kids and really for the benefit of our futures.
I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to leave it there. Perhaps we'll have you back. The title of the book is The Future of Us. Dr. Irwin Redlener, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. We should know by now that Donald Trump and the Republicans will do whatever they can to prevent Americans from experiencing a clean and healthy environment. For example, they are aggressively opposed to some of the most essential efforts to keep our air and water free of toxic pollutants. And even as our seas rise and our forests burn and temperatures reach record highs year after year, they refuse to take global warming seriously. Donald Trump's Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, believes that we should be burning fossil fuels like coal and oil more, not less. And one of the reasons, according to Perry, is that increased use of fossil fuels will help prevent sexual assault in Africa. Don't ask. Sometimes when I read this stuff, I feel like I'm hallucinating. The latest madness comes from Scott Pruitt, who was picked by Donald Trump to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Pruitt got rid of a half-dozen highly qualified scientists and academics from advisory positions with the EPA. He doesn't want anyone advising his agency who receives grant money from the agency to do scientific research. As the New York Times says, the move will effectively bar a large number of academic researchers, many of them experts in fields ranging from toxicology to epidemiology, from advising the EPA on scientific matters, since the agency is one of the largest funders of environmental research. In other words, the EPA will give scientists taxpayer money to do research, but will then, as a matter of policy, refuse to listen to whatever is learned from that research. I wish I was kidding. That's all for now. See you next time.